10 years disappeared in 4 seconds. That is how long it took for my signature to leave the page, for the lawyer across from me to slide the final copy into a black leather folder, and for every piece of my future to stop belonging to me. I did not know it then. I was smiling when it happened. That is the part that still makes me sick. People think betrayal announces itself. They think it arrives with shouting, with obvious lies, with a face twisted in guilt. They think there is some moment where the room changes temperature and your instincts scream, run. But that is not how real betrayal works when it is dressed in money, in polished language, in boardrooms with soft lighting and expensive water in glass bottles. Real betrayal is quiet. Real betrayal is organized. Real betrayal wears a navy suit, sits 2 seats away, and waits for you to sign page 37 while calling you family. We had built the company from nothing. I do not mean that in the dramatic startup cliché way people use when they really mean they started with a small loan and a cousin's office. I mean nothing. 1 folding table. 2 second-hand laptops. A printer that jammed so often we used to kick the tray and pray over it like it was possessed. We worked in a tiny room above a tailor shop because it was the only place in the city cheap enough that we could pay the first 3 months in advance and still have enough money left to eat. The walls sweated in the heat. The wiring was bad. Sometimes the generator downstairs would cough black smoke through the back window and stain our sample packs. Those were the early days. Ugly days. Holy days. His name was Adrian Cole, and before I hated him, I trusted him with the kind of devotion people should reserve for God or no one at all. We met at a business networking breakfast that neither of us could really afford to attend. He was late, overconfident, carrying a notebook with no logo and no pretense. I remember him because he spoke after 3 men in tailored jackets had spent 20 minutes using words like leverage and ecosystem without actually saying anything human. Adrian stood up and said, "Most businesses die because the founders love the dream more than the structure." I laughed out loud before I could stop myself. He looked at me, smiled without being offended, and added, "And some die because they build the structure with the wrong person." People around us clapped like they had heard something brilliant. I did not clap. I just watched him. Afterward, he found me near the coffee station and said, "You laughed like you had a better answer." I laughed because you're right, I told him. "You just sound very pleased with yourself." He grinned. Maybe because I am. That should have been my warning. Men who enjoy hearing themselves sound wise are often rehearsing for the moment they need to convince you of something terrible. But back then it felt like chemistry. Not romantic chemistry. Something more dangerous. Strategic chemistry. The kind that makes one ambitious mind recognize another and think, we could build something together that would scare people. We started talking. 1 meeting became 3. 3 became 100. He had vision and instincts. I had systems and execution. He could sell air if you let him. I could turn chaos into process before most people had finished admiring the mess. He was magnetic in rooms I hated. I was precise in rooms that made him restless. We did not mirror each other. We completed each other. At least, that is what I believed. The business started as a consultancy because consultancy is what people start when they have expertise, no capital, and a ridiculous tolerance for uncertainty. We helped struggling mid-sized brands fix operations, branding, and market positioning. It was not glamorous. It was survival work. We sat across from owners who wanted miracles, but fought every recommendation. We did deep audits for too little money. We stayed up all night turning broken companies into clean presentations. We took meetings in cafes because we did not want clients seeing the office upstairs from the tailor. We said yes to impossible deadlines because no one respects desperation until it produces results. The first year nearly killed us. There were weeks I forgot what day it was. We lived inside the business. I stopped buying nice clothes because every extra amount needed to go into the company account. Adrian kept saying, if we can stay alive past year 2, we become dangerous. I used to repeat it back to him when we were too tired to think. Dangerous. That was our word. We were not aiming to be comfortable. We were aiming to become the people the bigger firms could no longer ignore. We did not sign a formal partnership agreement in those early months. I know how insane that sounds now. It sounds worse when I say it out loud. But at the time, it felt almost noble. We had a basic company registration. We documented what had to be documented. But the deeper thing, the real thing, the understanding between us, was built on conversations at midnight, on promises made over terrible takeaway meals and ugly spreadsheets on faith. Equal ownership. Equal sacrifice. Equal reward. We said it so often it started to feel like law. We win together. He said it. I said it. We built around it. Year 2 was the year the company found its spine. We landed a regional retail chain that had been bleeding money for 16 months. Their board thought they needed a rebrand. We showed them they had a distribution problem, a staffing problem, and a marketing team reporting metrics that looked impressive but meant nothing. Adrian sold them courage. I sold them truth. We rebuilt their systems from the inside out, and 6 months later they were profitable for the first time in 2 years. That one case study changed everything. Suddenly we were not begging for meetings. We were being recommended into them. By year 4, we had staff. Real staff. Not freelancers. Not favors from friends. Employees with names on payroll and opinions in meetings and rent that depended on us making good decisions. We moved into a proper office with clean windows and a reception area Adrian insisted made us look bigger than we were. He said perception is part of growth. I rolled my eyes, but he was right more often than I liked admitting. That office became our proof of life. Clients visited and took us seriously. Investors began noticing us. Competitors mentioned us by name. By year 6, we had become what people politely call a market leader and what our rivals privately called a problem. We were no longer fixing companies. We were shaping sectors. We handled restructures, acquisitions, growth strategy, repositioning, operational turnarounds. We were brought in when businesses had money on the line and no room left for nonsense. We worked with founders, boards, private equity, family firms that had finally outgrown their own habits. There were magazine features, conference invitations, awards I pretended not to care about and Adrian pretended he barely noticed while making sure they were all displayed in reception. And through all of it, there was us. That was the lie at the center of everything. That no matter how much the company grew, there would always be an us untouched by scale. We had history. We had scars. We had built too much together for greed to fit between us. I believed shared struggle created unbreakable loyalty. What I did not understand then was that shared struggle can also create shared mythology. And mythology is dangerous because it can make you confuse memory with character. Just because someone suffered beside you does not mean they will not eventually calculate your value and decide they can survive without your side of the story. The first real crack showed up in year 7, though I did not name it a crack at the time. We were in a meeting with a private equity group interested in one of our clients. Adrian took the lead as usual, charming the room, shaping the narrative, making everyone feel smarter than they were. I stepped in when the discussion moved to post-acquisition integration because that was my territory. One of the investors asked a question about control in growth stage companies, and Adrian answered before I could. Control matters, he said, leaning back like a man explaining weather. Partnerships are useful, but eventually every serious company needs one clear hand on the wheel. He said it casually. The room moved on. I moved on. But something about it stayed with me. Later that evening, I asked him what he meant. He shrugged. I meant what I said. Scale changes governance. You talking in general or talking to me? He laughed. Mel, if I were talking to you, you would know. I let it go. That was another mistake. I had a habit of dismissing moments that unsettled me if I could not prove they were important. I wanted evidence before emotion. That served me in business. It failed me in betrayal. By year 8, acquisition interest had started circling us in earnest. Not the childish, informal kind where someone takes a founder to lunch and makes dreamy noises about synergies. Serious interest. Serious figures. We had built a company with intellectual property, systems, reputation, and leverage. Bigger firms wanted a piece of us, then all of us. Adrian loved those conversations. He was never more alive than when someone wealthy was trying to buy access to something he had built. I was more cautious. I did not oppose the idea, but I wanted structure, protections, long-term clarity. Our company was not just profitable. It was ours. He knew that mattered to me. He said all the right things. We are not selling out, he told me. We are scaling up. Different thing. Then, whatever happens, we both win. Then, no version of this happens unless you are protected. Protected. I remember that word because of how confidently he used it. Eventually, one offer separated itself from the rest. Harrow Vale Group. Large enough to accelerate us, sophisticated enough to make the deal look prestigious, aggressive enough to scare me just a little. They did not want to absorb us immediately. They wanted a structured merger, transitional autonomy, performance-linked value release, board representation, future options. It was complex, but not impossibly so. On paper, it looked like the perfect next step. More reach. More infrastructure. More capital. Enough independence to keep our identity alive. Adrian was convinced this was legacy. He used that word constantly. Legacy. It softened my resistance because I wanted that too. Not just wealth. Not just headlines. Something durable. The negotiations took months. That period is where the trap was built. At first, I was heavily involved in everything. Every call, every term discussion, every document review. Then the volume increased. Lawyers multiplied. Advisors appeared. Drafts became red lines, became revised red lines, became appendices and schedules and side letters. Whole afternoons disappeared in side clauses so technical they felt deliberately designed to exhaust any normal person. Adrian started handling more of the front end with Harrow Vale's deal team because he said it would be cleaner if one person managed momentum. I did not love it, but we were drowning in work on the company side too, and I trusted that nothing major would shift without both of us reviewing it. Another lie. The first time I saw the legal team trying to rush us, I pushed back. It was a Friday evening. We were in one of those all-glass conference rooms that look elegant until you have been trapped inside them for 6 hours. Harrow Vale's lead counsel kept referring to a block of governance language as market standard. I asked for examples from comparable transactions. He smiled the way men smile when they think a woman has become inconvenient rather than intelligent. With respect, he said, none of this is unusual. With equal respect, I answered, unusual is not the threshold. Explain it anyway. Adrian touched my elbow under the table. Not hard. Just enough to say, ease up. I hated that more than the lawyer's smile. Afterward, in the corridor, Adrian said, you know they already think you're defensive. I am defensive. It's my company. It is our company. Then why are you saying it like I am overreacting for acting like it? He exhaled. Because there's a difference between protecting the deal and choking it. I should have walked back into that room and blown the whole negotiation apart until every clause was read aloud and translated into plain language. Instead, I absorbed the criticism like a professional woman who has spent her whole career calibrating how much intensity she is allowed to show before being called difficult. Another mistake. Silence is expensive when everyone around you profits from your politeness. The pressure intensified as closing approached. There were deadlines tied to financing windows, tax treatment, board approvals, transition planning. Every conversation seemed to carry urgency. Harrow Vale's executives behaved like men doing us a favor by waiting. Adrian absorbed that pressure and passed it to me in smaller doses. We cannot keep circling the same questions. This has been reviewed. You need to trust the process. The lawyers are not going to let something outrageous slip through. The most dangerous phrase in business might be trust the process, especially when the process belongs to people whose incentives are not yours. By the final month, Document review had become a blur of exhaustion. I was leading major client work, managing our internal teams, handling transition strategy, dealing with personal grief I barely admitted even to myself because my mother had just been diagnosed with a chronic heart condition, and trying to remain sharp inside a transaction built on precision. Adrian started becoming strangely soothing whenever I raised concerns. I have it. I checked it. You're thinking 3 steps ahead. Let legal clean up the wording. There are forms of reassurance that are really methods of disarming you. I know that now. Closing day arrived wrapped in artificial triumph. The boardroom at Harrow Vale's headquarters was colder than it needed to be. There were flowers on a credenza for some reason, like we were at a tasteful funeral no one wanted to call a funeral. Our lawyers were there. Their lawyers were there. Adrian sat to my right, immaculate as ever, cufflinks reflecting the overhead light. Across from us sat men and women whose faces had perfected the expression of expensive patience. It was all polished and dry and terribly civilized. We signed in batches. Corporate resolutions. Disclosure letters. Transitional employment terms. Equity schedules. Board consent. It felt endless. There was champagne brought in before the final execution set, which should have offended me on principle. Celebration before completion. But everyone treated it as a good omen. Adrian leaned toward me and murmured, "This is the last hard day." I remember smiling. I remember believing him. The hidden clause sat in a section of the merger implementation schedule attached to an amended equity treatment appendix that had already passed through so many rounds of revision it looked less like a legal document and more like the fossil record of everyone's ambition. It was not bolded. It was not highlighted. It was not in a section whose heading would alarm a reasonable person. It was written in precise, bloodless language referring to performance-linked vesting realignment upon control threshold restructuring and key person continuity conditions. It cross-referenced 2 other definitions buried elsewhere. It was not designed to be understood at speed. It was designed to survive scrutiny by looking routine. And inside that clause was the mechanism that would separate my historical equity from future economic participation if certain post-merger governance changes occurred and if my executive continuity status was deemed materially altered under board discretion. That is the clean version. The real version is this. If they reorganized control after closing and if they define my role as changed enough, my ownership could be treated as unvested alignment equity and cancelled. Erased. Not sold. Not bought out fairly. Not negotiated down. Cancelled. I signed it. That is a sentence I still cannot read without feeling heat crawl up my throat. For the first few months after closing, everything looked fine. Better than fine. Better than we had ever dared imagining when we were sweating above that tailor shop. Press coverage was glowing. Existing clients were impressed. New opportunities opened instantly because Harrow Vale's network made doors move differently. Our revenue projections improved. We hired faster. We expanded into 2 new markets. There were dinners, photographs, congratulations, and the kind of praise people give when they think they are witnessing success in real time. But beneath the shine, things began shifting in ways too small to accuse and too consistent to ignore. Meetings moved without me. Board materials started arriving later than before. Adrian began taking certain Harrow Vale calls alone, saying it was mostly politics and I hated politics anyway. He said it like a kindness. My reporting line, which had always been straightforward because I was a founder, started becoming murkier under the new structure. A human resources executive from Harrow Vale scheduled what she called an alignment conversation and asked bizarrely specific questions about whether I felt energized by my evolving remit. I remember staring at her and thinking, what evolving remit? I asked her directly if there had been any formal change to my responsibilities. She smiled and said no, not formal, just natural integration drift. Natural integration drift. There are phrases people use when they want to move your chair while pretending the floor moved itself. I mentioned some of it to Adrian. He always had a reason ready. This is normal after a merger. You are reading politics as personal. They are trying to understand where everyone fits. We need to show flexibility. That last one unsettled me most. Everyone. Flexibility for whom? We had not built our company by becoming vague just because larger people entered the room. Around month 5, I noticed something else. Documents that referred to founder leadership began saying Adrian by name and me by function. He was framed as strategic continuity. I was framed as operational leadership. It sounds small unless you understand how future power is constructed through language long before anyone announces a change. Names become authority. Functions become replaceable. I started asking for more paperwork. Not dramatically. Quietly. Copies. Updated schedules. Internal governance notes. Transitional role definitions. The legal team became slippery in a way I could feel more than prove. Delays. Partial responses. Still being finalized. Administrative issue. Will revert. I remember going home one Thursday night with 3 folders in my bag and the distinct sense that something had already happened without me. 6 months after closing, an external audit pack landed in my inbox for review before a board cycle. It was sent by a finance manager who had probably never even met me properly. There was nothing dramatic about the email. No warnings. No red flags. Just attached ownership summary tables and implementation status notes. I opened it while half distracted, expecting routine confirmation. Then I saw the capitalization table. My name was not there. There are moments the body knows before the mind does. My fingers went cold. I thought the page had filtered incorrectly. I refreshed it. Opened the attachment again. Scrolled slower. There was Adrian. There were Harrow Vale entities. There was a pool for retained incentives. There were board-linked tranches. There were management alignment units. There was no me. I checked the entity list again, then the notes column, then the footnotes. That is where I found the reference. Reclassification pursuant to continuity vesting adjustment under Schedule 8. Schedule 8. I pulled the signed closing set from our internal data room. My pulse was loud enough to make reading difficult. It took me 20 minutes to navigate through the maze of appendices because every cross-reference led to another. When I found Schedule 8, I knew before I fully understood it that I had stepped on something lethal. The clause had not acted immediately on closing. It had waited. It was tied to a governance trigger that occurred when Harrow Vale adjusted certain post-merger control rights and redefined founder executive positions during integration. My role had been reframed in internal documents from co-founder executive authority to transitional operational executive subject to performance continuity assessment. That assessment, overseen by the Board Compensation Committee, had determined that my continuity status no longer matched the vesting condition attached to my carried equity alignment. Once that happened, the clause did what it was built to do. My future economic participation vanished. My historical contribution became emotionally relevant and legally useless. I sat in my office for almost an hour without moving. Every sound around me became insultingly normal. Phones ringing. Keyboards tapping. Someone laughing in the corridor. An assistant asking another assistant whether the courier had arrived. The world had the audacity to keep behaving like nothing catastrophic had occurred. I called our external counsel first. Voicemail. Then his deputy. No answer. Then I called Adrian. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, he said, cheerful, casual. I'm between meetings. What is Schedule 8? Silence. Very brief. Very controlled. What do you mean? Do not do that. My voice had gone flat in a way that frightened even me. What is Schedule 8 and why is my equity gone? Another pause. Come to my office, he said. Not I will explain. Not there must be some misunderstanding. Come to my office. That was when hope died. His office at Harrow Vale's building had already begun to look more like theirs than ours. Less personality. More gray. More glass. More objects selected by someone who thinks success should feel expensive and empty. He was standing when I walked in, which would have looked respectful to anyone who did not know him. To me, it meant he had prepared himself. I closed the door and put the audit summary on his desk. My name is gone. He looked down at it, then back at me with the expression of a man deciding how much performance the situation required. We need to talk calmly. No, I said. You need to answer. He inhaled through his nose, sat down, and folded his hands. The post-integration treatment was more complicated than expected. Do not speak to me like I am a junior employee in a debrief. What happened? He met my eyes then, and what I saw there was not guilt. Not even cruelty. Just decision. The clause was activated after the board's continuity assessment. You knew. I understood the structure. You knew. His face tightened, annoyed now that I was forcing him to stand inside the ugliness instead of letting him keep hiding inside legal phrasing. We all knew the structure might evolve. We all. That phrase still burns. We all knew, I repeated. Who is we? He said nothing. Who is we, Adrian? The lawyers. Harrowvale. The board. I laughed. I could not help it. It came out wrong, ragged, and disbelieving. Everyone knew except me. That is not fair. Fair. I stepped closer to the desk. You erased me with a clause, and you want to discuss fairness. It did not erase your contribution. It erased my ownership. He looked away for the first time. You signed the documents. There it was. The sentence that turned 10 years into acid. You signed the documents. It was not loud. He did not shout it. That would have been easier to hate. He said it with the calm finality of a man who believes law has washed the blood off his hands. Something inside me changed then. Not broke. Broke had happened earlier in my office when I saw the cap table. This was different. This was ignition. Pain becoming shape. You planned this. I protected the company. No. You protected yourself. He leaned back, and for one awful second I saw the old Adrian, the one from the breakfast years ago, the one who loved hearing himself explain things. At this level, he said, shared control becomes a liability. I stared at him. There it was again. The old sentence from the private equity meeting, now with its mask removed. One clear hand on the wheel. You decided I was the hand to cut off. I decided the company needed a stable strategic structure. You mean a structure where I could build and then disappear? That is not what happened. It is exactly what happened. He rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. Mel, listen to yourself. You are making this emotional. I almost smiled then, because of course that was the final insult. Build an empire with a woman's discipline, use her precision, rely on her instincts, cash out on her labor, then when she names the betrayal, call it emotion. I left before I did something that would have satisfied my anger and ruined my leverage. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a beautifully managed assassination. Access restrictions increased. First subtle, then obvious. Board meeting invitations stopped including me by default. My assistant was reassigned under the pretext of integration efficiency. 2 team leaders who had reported directly to me were informed of an interim revised structure while I was working through executive transition matters. Human Resources invited me to a meeting about my future pathway in the organization. Future pathway. As if I was lucky to still be in the building. I hired independent counsel the same day. This time not the comfortable firm that had handled the merger and clearly belonged to everyone but me. A brutal litigation specialist named Elena Sayeg, who read the document pack in 48 hours and told me the truth without perfume. They built a trap, she said, tapping the relevant pages with one manicured finger. A very sophisticated one. They likely believed you would never read this combination of schedules closely enough before closing because the trigger was deferred and the language looks technical rather than punitive. Can we reverse it? Her silence answered first. Not easily, she said. The clause is ugly but intelligently drafted. To unwind it, we would have to prove non-disclosure, bad faith structuring, fiduciary breach, potentially collusion in how your role was redefined post-closing. That is expensive, slow, and public. Public. There is a type of violence powerful institutions prefer because they know decent people fear mess. If the path to justice is long enough, expensive enough, humiliating enough, many people choose private survival instead. They count on your exhaustion. Elena kept talking. Options. Strategy. Preservation. Discovery pathways. Settlement possibilities. But my mind had snagged on something simpler and more unbearable. He had known exactly what kind of woman I was. He knew I would not blow up the building on day one. He knew I would think carefully. He knew I would weigh consequence. He had weaponized my discipline against me. The staff began noticing something was wrong, though no one asked directly at first. That is another thing power does. It teaches people to become fluent in silence. They sensed the shift. They saw who was appearing in photos and who was suddenly absent. Rumors moved under the surface. Adrian increased his visibility with the senior team. Harrow Vale's communications people started pushing narratives about consolidated strategic leadership. My name appeared less in internal announcements, then less in client-facing materials, then less in anything that suggested ownership of the company's future. History was being revised in real time. Do you know what it feels like to watch your life's work continue without your name attached to it? To walk past conference rooms where frameworks you designed are being presented by people who entered 3 months ago. To hear someone describe a process you built as part of Adrian's leadership vision. To sit in a car park after another humiliating integration meeting and wonder whether you are grieving money, identity, or the death of the person you used to be before you understood how efficiently someone could remove you. It is not one feeling. It is a colony of feelings. Shame, fury, sickness, astonishment. A primitive ache that sits behind the ribs and makes sleep feel like a place you no longer have permission to enter. For a while, I stopped recognizing myself. I woke before dawn with my jaw already clenched. I replayed documents in my head like prayers written in another language. I forgot to eat, then binged on things that tasted like cardboard. Friends called and I let their messages pile up because every version of what had happened sounded too humiliating to say aloud. How do you explain that you helped build a company into a multi-million-dollar force and then sign the clause that allowed them to erase you? How do you say that without hearing your own failure louder than the betrayal? My mother, sick as she was, understood before anyone else. I visited her one Sunday afternoon. She was sitting by the window in a light blue wrapper, peeling an orange with the concentration of someone who knows small acts still matter. She looked at my face for less than 5 seconds and said, "Who has done this to you?" I sat down across from her and tried to be controlled. I lasted maybe 3 sentences before the whole thing cracked open. Not dramatic sobbing. Worse. The kind of crying that sounds like a person choking on disbelief. She listened. When I finished, she placed a section of orange on a saucer and said, "So now you know." I laughed through tears. Know what? That loyalty without paper is faith, not business. I looked at her. That is all you have to say. No, she said softly. I also have to say this. Do not die in the place where he buried you. That sentence saved me. Not immediately. I still had weeks of ruin ahead. But it planted something. A refusal. Elena pushed for document preservation and quietly signaled potential claims. Harrow Vale responded with polished aggression. They denied wrongdoing, framed the matter as a contractual dispute, and suggested I had benefited substantially from the transaction overall. That last part almost made me spit blood. Benefit. As if a generous dinner should satisfy the person whose house you stole. The settlement talks began because institutions hate uncertainty, not injustice. I learned very quickly how these rooms work. They do not ask what is right. They ask what is survivable, what is containable, what number or title or confidentiality package can make the problem behave. Adrian attended one of the early sessions. He wore navy again. Of course he did. He spoke rarely, letting counsel carry the filth. At one point the mediator asked whether there was any possibility of preserving a future working relationship. I turned and looked directly at Adrian. With him, I said, I would not share an elevator. That was the first time I saw genuine discomfort cross his face. Not because I had insulted him, because I had broken the script. He expected anger he could pathologize, maybe even tears he could call regrettable. He did not expect clarity stripped of hope. There is nothing colder than a woman who no longer wants restoration. The final settlement was substantial enough that anyone hearing the number out of context would assume I had won. I had not won. I had limited my bleeding. There is a difference. Money can compensate for some forms of damage. It cannot return authorship. It cannot unteach your nervous system what betrayal feels like. It cannot restore the years before knowledge. I resigned 3 weeks later. No dramatic goodbye. No company-wide speech. No scorched earth email. Just a statement negotiated to mutual satisfaction, which is corporate language for everyone lies politely and the people with the best lawyers get to keep most of the furniture. The first month after leaving was terrifying. Not because I lacked options. Because I lacked shape. My whole adult identity had been braided into that company. My routines, my confidence, my language, my sense of worth. Without the machinery of work and war, I could hear myself too clearly. Every silence became an accusation. Every morning asked, who are you if the thing you built has been turned into a place where your name no longer fits? I considered disappearing for a while. Truly. Not dying. Just vanishing from the whole ecosystem. Moving somewhere quieter. Doing advisory work under the radar. Becoming smaller because being visible had become associated with risk. But pain has a strange honesty. Once it stops screaming, it starts teaching. I began rereading everything. Not just the merger documents. Everything. Old shareholder notes. Founder emails. Board packs. Term sheets from early acquisition approaches. Governance structures from companies we had advised. Laws. Commentary. Cases. Patterns. I studied betrayal like it was an industry vertical. Where does power hide? How do institutions dress predation in procedure? How does language move value from one person to another while maintaining the appearance of mutual consent? The more I learned, the more one truth kept surfacing. What happened to me was personal, yes, but it was also structural. Founders, especially the operational ones, especially the ones who believe contribution speaks for itself, are vulnerable in ways ambition rarely admits. Builders assume the work will protect them. It does not. Only paper protects. Only structure. Only clarity enforced before celebration. That realization became the beginning of my second life. I did not start another company immediately. I was too raw for that, and raw people make hungry decisions. Instead, I started advising founders privately, then publicly, then obsessively. Women first, because they recognized something in my face before I even told the full story. Then mixed teams. Then boards. Then firms who had once ignored the governance side of their genius because growth had made them feel invincible. I built frameworks. I developed founder protection audits. I became the person in the room who reads the schedule everyone else wants to skip. The irony was grotesque and satisfying at once. The thing Adrian used to erase me became the exact territory where I turned impossible to dismiss. And then, because life has a dark sense of humor, I started doing very well. Not overnight. Not with glamorous headlines. But steadily. Cleanly. Profitably. My work spread because it saved people money, pain, and humiliation. Founders sent other founders. Lawyers who had once underestimated me began requesting collaboration. Private firms brought me in before transactions, not after disasters. I had built a reputation the first time through brilliance and endurance. I built the second one through clarity sharpened by blood. 2 years after my exit, I was speaking at a leadership summit in London about governance blind spots in founder-led companies. The room was full. The panel before mine had run over. I was standing backstage with a bottle of water when I saw Adrian across the corridor. Older by maybe 3 years in the face, though only 2 had passed. Richer looking. Emptier looking. He was laughing with a man from one of the firms that used to chase us. Then he noticed me. There are moments when the universe offers you a ridiculous kind of symmetry. He approached carefully, as if coming near a fire whose habits he remembered. Mel. Adrian. A beat. You look well. I am. Another beat. I've followed some of your work, he said. It's impressive. There are apologies people give when they are still trying not to kneel. This was one of them. Compliment as reconnaissance. Thank you. He nodded. You turned it into something. I almost said, you mean you turned it into something, and I refused to die there. But I had outgrown the need to let him hear my sharpest lines. Instead I said, I turned myself into something. That landed. His eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, then lifted. For what it's worth, not a week goes by that I don't think about how badly that ended. How it ended, I said, or how you chose to end it. He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, at the time I believed I was making the only decision that secured the business. And now? He looked toward the corridor, toward the room where people were taking their seats. Now I think securing the business cost more than I admitted. There are women who would call that closure. I do not. Closure is overrated and often mostly for the comfort of the person who caused the damage. What I felt in that moment was not forgiveness and not triumph. It was distance. The kind that proves healing has substance, because the man who once could alter my pulse with a sentence now sounded like an old case study with good tailoring. My session starts in 10 minutes, I said. He nodded. I know. I walked away. On stage, I told a sanitized version of my story. Not names. Not company identifiers. But truth. I spoke about founders who confuse effort with protection. About the seduction of trust. About the politics of integration. About how clauses do not appear from nowhere. They're invitations accepted by people who think you will not read them, not understand them, or not fight them. I said, the most dangerous line in any major transaction is often the one everyone tells you is standard. People laugh the way rooms laugh when they are being warned and entertained at the same time. Then I said, never let celebration outrun comprehension. No one laughed then. Afterward, a young woman waited until the crowd thinned. She introduced herself as the co-founder of a fast-growing health technology company. She looked brilliant and tired and right on the edge of becoming too successful to remain naive. My partner keeps saying I'm paranoid for pushing on legal detail, she said. After hearing you, I think maybe I'm just awake. I smiled. Stay awake. That is the real ending if there is one. Not the settlement. Not the summit. Not even seeing Adrian again. The real ending is that I learned what betrayal costs, and then I made that cost useful. Not noble. Useful. I do not romanticize pain anymore. Pain is not a blessing. It is a debt. You either let it collect interest inside you, or you force it to finance something better. Do I still think about the company? Yes. Sometimes with grief. Sometimes with contempt. Sometimes with a strange detached tenderness for the younger version of me who believed shared sacrifice guaranteed shared honor. I miss pieces of what I built there. I miss some of the people. I miss the clean intoxication of those early years when ambition still felt innocent. But I do not miss the lie. Because here is the truth I was too loyal to admit. The empire was never just the company. The empire was me. My mind. My systems. My discipline. My instinct for structure. My refusal to quit in ugly seasons. My ability to see weakness in operations and turn it into strength. He could take my name off a cap table. He could not take the engine that made the company worth buying in the first place. That was his biggest mistake. He thought ownership was the same as authorship. It is not. He thought because the paper erased me, history would follow. It did not. Some wounds change you. Some betrayals break you. And some people, quietly and deliberately, force you to become someone much harder to erase. That is what happened to me. They thought they buried me in fine print. What they really did was teach me how power works when it no longer has to pretend. And once you understand that, once you really understand it, You stop begging to be included in rooms built on your silence. You build your own room. You write the paper. You read every line. And when someone smiles too softly while telling you to trust the process, you smile back, close the folder, and say the most expensive word in business. No. Because the truth is, they did not just try to take my ownership. They tried to reduce my entire existence to a legal technicality. They tried to make 10 years of sacrifice look like an administrative detail. They tried to turn my blood, my instinct, my sleepless nights, my systems, my discipline, and my loyalty into something that could be crossed out by a board decision and a cleverly placed clause. But people like Adrian always make the same mistake. They think the empire is the paperwork. They think the empire is the company name. They think the empire is the board seat, the shareholding, the title, the access, the applause, the press release, the valuation. It is not. The empire was never just the company. The empire was me. It was my mind, my execution, my endurance, my ability to walk into chaos and leave behind structure, my ability to see what was broken and force it to work, my refusal to quit when things were ugly, uncertain, underfunded, and thankless. That is the part he could not steal. That is the part no clause could cancel. That is the part no board could vote away. And once I understood that, I stopped grieving like a woman who had lost everything. I started rebuilding like a woman who had finally seen the rules clearly. I did not become softer after that. I became sharper. I did not become bitter. I became precise. I did not become obsessed with revenge. I became obsessed with clarity. That is what saved me. Not anger. Not public outrage. Not the fantasy of watching him collapse under the weight of his own greed. What saved me was learning. What saved me was rebuilding. What saved me was refusing to let the worst thing that ever happened to me become the final thing that defined me. That is what quiet storm is. Not revenge. Not noise. Just a woman who understood, quietly and deliberately, what it truly costs to rise. And if I am honest, that version of me is more dangerous than the one he betrayed. Because the first version still believed loyalty would protect her. This version reads every line. The first version thought shared struggle guaranteed shared honor. This version understands that memory and character are not the same thing. The first version thought being indispensable meant being safe. This version knows that if it is not written clearly, protected fully, and structured properly, it is vulnerable no matter how much love, history, labor, or sacrifice built it. That is the lesson no one tells you when you start from nothing with someone you trust. They tell you to dream bigger. They tell you to move faster. They tell you to scale. They tell you to be bold. But they do not tell you that success attracts people who know how to weaponize your exhaustion. They do not tell you that celebration can become camouflage. They do not tell you that the most dangerous betrayal is the one that sounds professional. And they definitely do not tell you that sometimes the person clapping the loudest at the signing table is the one who already knows you are the only one in the room who does not understand what you just agreed to. I know that now. And because I know it now, I will never again confuse trust with protection. I will never again let another person hold the pen while I hold the faith. I will never again mistake a polished process for an honest one. That chapter of my life cost me more than money. It cost me innocence. It cost me certainty. It cost me the old version of myself that still believed hard work automatically earns fairness. But in return, it gave me sight. And sight is expensive. It lets you see the pattern beneath the performance. It lets you hear the threat inside the reassurance. It lets you notice when language is being used to reduce your worth before anyone has the courage to say it plainly. It lets you walk away sooner. It lets you protect what is yours before the applause starts. It lets you understand, with terrifying clarity, that some people do not betray you because you were weak. They betray you because you were valuable, and they wanted the value without the witness. That was my real crime in Adrian's eyes. Not incompetence. Not failure. Not weakness. Witness. I knew what we built. I knew what it took. I knew where the bones were buried because I had helped bury them. And men like him can tolerate your brilliance for years, sometimes decades, as long as they believe they can eventually separate it from ownership. As long as they believe they can keep the engine and remove the evidence of who built it beside them. He almost got away with that. Almost. Because while he kept the company, I kept the truth. And in the long run, truth travels. It travels in reputation, in pattern recognition, in the way rooms respond when your name comes up, in the way people begin to understand who the real architect was, even if the paperwork once suggested otherwise. That is why I do not need to scream about what happened anymore. I do not need revenge to validate the wound. I do not need his downfall to justify my pain. I do not need him destroyed in order for me to be restored. I only need to remain honest about what it cost, what it taught me, and what I became because of it. And what I became is not easy to erase. If this story is hitting something real for you right now, hit subscribe. I post every day, and I do not want you to miss what comes next. Because stories like this are never just stories. They are warnings. They are mirrors. They are reminders that some losses are not random. Some betrayals are built carefully, patiently, and with full intention. And if you are building something right now, if you are trusting someone because history makes them feel safe, if you are telling yourself loyalty is enough because the journey has been long and the struggle was shared, then hear me clearly. Read the sentence that feels too small to matter. Question the phrase everyone calls standard. Slow down when the room wants speed. And never let gratitude blind you to structure. Because sometimes the clause that destroys you is not only buried in the contract. Sometimes it is buried in the part of you that still wants to believe the person who built beside you would never profit from your blind spot. I believed that once. I paid for it. Then I learned. Then I rebuilt. And trust me when I tell you this. The woman who rises after being erased is far more dangerous than the one who still thinks she is safe. If you're sitting on a deal right now and something feels off, don't ignore it. That's not paranoia. That's your survival instinct. Subscribe. Because there is another storm coming tomorrow.